Good afternoon and welcome to another episode of Sheriff's Podcast with yours truly, Joel Bhagwandin, where we will spend the next 30 minutes or so engaging in some discussion and sharing my insights and analysis on topical national issues. Today I want to commence today and for the ensuing podcasts, the remaining podcasts until elections, I want to commit these podcasts towards reviewing the PPPC's Manifesto of 2020. And so today I just want to introduce that segment of what I intend to do by going through the manifesto and briefly look at selected sectors or selected commitments in their manifesto and examine whether the manifesto deliverables were actually implemented. Before I do so, you would recall, for those who are paying attention and who are religiously tuning into this program, you would recall that in the last episode with me, we discussed a number of issues pertaining to cost of living measures, fiscal measures in response to cost of living, and the discussion, some of it surrounded briefly disposable income. So I want to tie that in with the manifesto review today, because there is a particular commentary that I said last week by someone associated with one of the opposition parties, one of the contending parties, who said that the minimum wage, or what they are calling a livable wage, should be $250,000. And that was said by an individual who appeared on another podcast with some other group of people. And the argument by one of the persons on the podcast with that individual brought in the economics argument and inflation and so on. Now, I would stay away for now from the conventional economics argument about wages and the relationship of wages and inflation and so on. What I want to explain, and that for viewers to understand, is that income is a function of the economy. Income is a function of the economy. It is a function of the economy whereby it is dependent on the economy's capability to generate income. It is linked to production, the production of goods and services, and the monetization of those goods and services. The revenue derived therefrom determines the level of income that a firm or a company could pay in the form of wages and salary. Now, for the purpose of this simple explanation, an economy is composed of three actors. There are the firms, F-I-R-M-S, firms, or companies. The firms engage in productive activities, the production of goods and services. The second, there is the government. And the third, household. The householders work in the firms then, or the companies then engage in productive activities. They produce goods and services that in turn generate revenue. And the firms pay to the householders, wages and salary in return for their services, their labor that they provide. And they also, from that revenue, the firms and the companies pay taxes to the government, which is government revenue, tax revenue. And so the government creates that policy environment in which firms are able to expand their operations and engage in the production of goods and services, simply put. So income is a function of the economy, and the income paid to an individual is determined by several factors. The income that you earn is determined by several factors. It is determined by, number one, the company's ability to afford the level of income, which means that the income paid out, your wages and salaries, which is your income, the wages and salaries, that is an expense to the company or the organization, that is dependent on the revenue that company generates. So therefore, that accounts for a percentage or a portion of that revenue. And therefore, a company has to determine what portion of their revenue they can afford to pay in wages and salaries. So that's the first determinant. It is dependent on the level of revenue. The level of the revenue that the firm generates determine the level of wages and salaries that the organization can pay to its employees, whether that is 10% of revenue, 15% of revenue, 20% of revenue, or 30% of revenue. The second determinant of wages and salary is the individual's academic or professional credentials. So qualifications and professional credentials is a second factor. The third factor, or the third determinant, is your level of experience and competence. So level of experience and competence, qualifications and professional credentials, and first and foremost, you can be the most qualified, you can be the most competent, but if the organization cannot afford to pay a certain level of wages, that is the number one factor. So when one conceives this idea that regardless of who you are, regardless of what profession I'm engaged in, what is my qualification, what is my level of experience, what is the level of my competence, the minimum I must earn is $250,000. It is a how do I put it? It is a fundamentally flawed ridiculous conception. Very flawed, very impractical, and an absurd conception. I don't want to say it's a misconception. It is an absurd, it is a flawed, it is an ill-conceived conception. That's not how income is determined, or the wages you earn and the salary you earn is determined. I'm breaking this thing down for the average viewer, the average audience out there. Now, the question now arises, what is the level of income that an organization can afford? Is there a benchmark? The question is, there is a benchmark. The benchmark is an organization, whether it's a for-profit or a non-profit organization, or whether it's the government as an employer, the wages bill, the employment cost, the maximum benchmark globally, and there are studies to this effect, the maximum revenue that is allocated towards employment cost, maximum level, is 30%. 30% of revenue is allocated. That's the maximum. On a global level, the average, the lower end of the scale is 15%. So if you want to argue, or if you want to determine in an objective manner with that benchmark in mind, if you want to determine in an objective manner whether an organization is paying its employees poorly, or whether that organization is paying their employees a decent salary, that's the indicator you look for. So if you look at, if their employment cost is less than 15% of revenue, then we can safely say that that organization is underpaying their employees. We can say if your employment cost is less than 15%, then we can say you're underpaying your employees. If your employment cost is 30%, then that's the maximum, because the other 70% of your revenue, you have to go, that goes towards, a portion of that goes towards production costs, depending on the type and the nature of organization, the nature of commercial or industrial activities that organization is engaged in. So 30% maximum or minimum 15%, that is your employment cost expense. You still have production expenses, you still have cost of goods, selling and general and administration expenses, operating expenses, other overhead expenses to cover. And then by the time you deduct all of your expenses, the profit margin is about, in some industries, 10%, 15%, some less than 10% in net profit margin. So that's how you determine whether an organization is underpaying or compensating their employees adequately. That's the first benchmark you look for, or the first indicator you examine. Now, let's make it a little bit more complex. Now, we can argue that an organization employment cost may be 30 or 31% or 32%. And based on your ranking, based on your organizational structure, we can argue that within your organizational structure, based on the size of your employees, the number of employees, some employees are underpaid or paid a relatively low income. But then how do you balance that now? How do you balance that if the total employment cost is the maximum that the organization can afford? So here is where now, this is now not, this element of the discussion has nothing to do with the external environment or the macroeconomic environment or government policy. This now has to do with the business model of the organization and the operating strategy of the organization. So if let's create a scenario and say that a company has X amount of employees, and the employees are saying that, listen, we want better wages. Or let's flip it. Let's say that company, because of the competitive environment, and which is the case in our case right now in the economy, there's a very competitive environment for labor. It's a very competitive environment because we have a very small pool of qualified human resources, and the companies coming in and those expanding, they have to compete with better wages from oil and gas sector, from construction sector, from the service sector, and from the government sector. So now companies are under pressure. On one hand, they can't afford to increase their employment cost. But how do you maintain your employment cost constant at 30% of revenue? And how do you still pay your employees better? That means companies would have to start looking at, one of the solutions is companies would have to start looking at redesigning their operating model and their business model. That means how can they invest in and deploy technology in terms of automating some of their processes, in terms of deploying technology, artificial intelligence, which ultimately would mean reducing your workforce. Because if you reduce your workforce, you can restructure your organization by harnessing technology, keep your wages bill constant, because that's the maximum you can afford to pay based on the level of revenue that you generate. And by restructuring your organization in that manner, which would come at the expense of cutting jobs, to be able to pay a more lean organization, a more lean model, less employees, less labor intensive, and higher wages per employee. So I'm explaining this to you. It is a function of the market. Income is a function of the market. Income is a function of the market. 15 years ago, let me give you a personalized example. There is this, and I want to give this example because there is this expectation. There is this expectation or a notion rather that an organization or an employer or a prospective employer must pay you a certain level of income, must pay you a certain level based on your qualification. Now that too has to be grounded in the pragmatic reality of the state and structure of the market. And when I say market, I mean the economy. What do I mean by that? Often I hear university graduates with the university degrees, their bachelor's degree, their master's degree, and when they go into the market job hunting, they expect to earn super salary. They expect, because they just come out with a university degree, they expect to earn a super salary for their qualification. Forget that they don't have any experience or much experience, and forget about their competence. Because they have a master's or a bachelor's, that qualification should command them earning a super salary. So when they're placed in a junior level, and the organization say to them, you got to work your way up, you got to start from the bottom, that's when they get a reality shock. And that conflicts with their expectation. And that creates a certain perception in society, a certain perception about wages and the relationship with wages or income to qualification. When I completed my master's in 2017. Now listen to this. I completed my master's in 2017. I started my career in banking when I just left school, high school. My first job was in a bank. Fell in love with banking. And I fell in love with banking, and I developed this aspiration to become a banking executive. Very early on in my career, I developed this aspiration to become a banking executive. Now, practically speaking, the executive structure of a financial institution is made up of just 5 people. There is one chief executive officer, and there is about 2 or 3 senior level managers below the chief executive, and all the rest, and below that you have different levels and different tiers of managerial positions and supervisor and so on. So if you got to go up, and everybody is qualified, everybody has a degree, or most persons are qualified, most persons have a degree or an MBA, and some of them are at supervisor level, some are junior clerks, some are different level management, and the people already occupying the executive already at the top, they have age on their side and they're not going anywhere. They have age on their side and they're not going anywhere. Now let me put a little bit of historical context to that. When 3 decades ago, when the private sector was now developing, was just created post 1992, and we had financial institutions, indigenous financial institutions such as Demerara Bank that was created, and well, our banking sector would have evolved from foreign ownership to government ownership and then local ownership. In those days, the persons who elevated from the bottom to the executive level, they elevated rapidly. And the reason they elevated rapidly is because in those days you hardly had much people with a master's degree. You hardly had people with master's degree. And in those days, most of the qualified people then were on their qualifications through government-sponsored scholarship or some other private or other foreign government scholarship. So through a scholarship program, almost all those persons in that era qualify themselves through scholarships. And so we had very, very few, and that is why that few people that came back to serve Guyana, those are the ones who elevated quickly, whether it was in public sector, the government sector, or whether it was in the private sector. Today, fast forward to today, we have way more, almost in every organization, a high level of the employees are academically qualified, and therefore you don't have within a single organization, if one organization has 500 employees and 50% of them got master's degree, you only got 5 positions at the top, at the executive level, that would pay the super salary. So how then do you maximize your earning potential? How then do you maximize your earning potential legitimately? So you have a choice to make whether you want to stick with an organization, compete within an organization, develop yourself within an organization, and elevate within that organization, and want to live depend on a single source of income, or you have to decide whether you're not going to take that path, you're going to take another path, a legitimate path, and maximize your ability to earn more in relationship to the level of your competence, the level of your perceived competence and capacity and capability. And that is the decision that people have to make in relationship to their level of earnings or the capacity to earn. And this is looking at it from a very practical and realistic standpoint. So very early on, I recognize and appreciate that I can't stay and wait, because it will take years. And so very early on, when I completed my master's, and I'm sure that my personalized story can be multiplied by several 100,000 of people who think like this, who have goals, career goals, professional goals, and who want to be entrepreneurs and so on. So very early on I recognized that, and very early on I sought to engage in additional legitimate income generating activities, such as teaching part-time and then engaging in consulting and etc. So now this leads to another question. So and this is another thing that the same individual I'm referring to. So what I'm implying here now, for people to maximize their income, you get another source of income. They now come and argue, oh, so we can't get this, so this is what the government is saying, so we must work 2 jobs. No. You have to be practical, because no government or no employer would ever be able to satisfy your needs and wants. I've gone through all the different factors and determinants. I've explained that income is a function of the market economy, and income is then determined by the level of revenue that organization could generate. It is also determined by, first and foremost, and it is also determined by your level of qualification, experience, and competence. But you can be super qualified, but you still would not be able to may not be able to earn what you expect, because the organization itself has constraint. This is how much they could afford to pay you. So you have choices to make. The important thing is that the economy is providing so much opportunities to engage in other types of activities to maximize or diversify your income or your earning potential. And this is not to say that we're promoting this sort of culture from a negative point of view. All the big economies, the United States, people work 2 and 3 jobs. Everywhere you go, people work People do multiple things because they have goals, and so you have to ground your expectation. Point I'm trying to make is that you have to ground your expectation in reality and pragmatism, and recognize that your earning capacity is really dependent on you and the choices that you make, not an expectation, an unrealistic expectation that may never be met by the market. So that is what I wanted to explain about income and wages in particular. The key takeaway is that an organization can only afford to pay you a certain level of income based on the level of revenue that it generates. Now, if you look across the public sector, the government sector wages bill, total wages bill is about 35% of total tax revenue. 35% of total tax revenue. If you look at the financial statement by some of the large private sector companies that are publicly traded, whose financial statements are publicly available, you look at their employment cost, it's about 30% of revenue. So that means those companies, those organizations, including the government, they're paying the level of wages and salary that they're paying their employees is at the maximum level that they could financially afford to pay, And if that does not satisfy you, and the market demands more, but with this, bearing in mind that this is the maximum they could pay, then that brings into focus now the question of redesigning your organization, restructuring your operating model, reducing your workforce size, deploying technology, deploying artificial intelligence to reduce your workforce size so that by reducing your number of employees you could pay higher wages. So I'm just explaining to you how this is a function of the market, enabled by a market-driven macroeconomic fundamentals, macroeconomic, private sector driven, market driven policies to enable that level of growth and to enable to foster and harness a level of innovation within the market. Now, I have 5 minutes remaining to 30 minutes, but it was very important for me to, in a simple manner, in a simplistic way, to break down these complex notions, to explain to you how the market works and how income is determined. Now, if I begin the manifesto review, that will take us another 30 minutes. So I think, well, let me just spend the next 5 minutes and review a couple of things quickly. So this is the manifesto, the PPPC's manifesto, 2020 manifesto, which was the basis upon which they were elected. Now that they're going back to the electorate for another term, the PPPC is on record stating that they've exceeded their manifesto promises or targets. I don't want to call it promise. Let's call it manifesto deliverables or targets. So I will sit with you for the next few episodes starting from today, briefly, to look at this manifesto, go through it, and make that determination whether indeed what they are saying was actually achieved. Now, they've been saying that on record, and I've also been saying that as an analyst over the last couple of years in my public writings and discourse on national policy issues and public policy issues. And it's been 2 years, 2 years ago, I would have publicly stated, based on my own assessment, that they have exceeded the manifesto target. But now is the opportune time, now is the appropriate time to go through this manifesto and to examine in some detail these targets. On the very first page, and given that I've dealt with this extensively in a previous podcast, so we'll start here and we'll just go it over briefly. The very first page, the focus was job creation, creating jobs. And this is what they said. Consistent with the objective of providing 50,000 new jobs and enhancing the well-being of all Guyanese, the following are some of the policies and measures which the next PPPC government will implement. And these are the measures. Reduce the bureaucracy, processing time for applications and other paperwork required for doing business. Restore zero-rated VAT for machinery and equipment for agriculture, mining and forestry. And I can tell you that this was done. You can verify this. You could verify this in the very first budget, the 2020 budget. These measures were implemented in the first budget, which was called an emergency budget in the circumstances of 2020. Provide more incentives for small business and young entrepreneurs, including microcredit facilities. This was done, and this is a subtopic by itself that I'll have to dedicate an exclusive podcast to talk about. Reverse the increased cost of licenses and permits for doing business and accessing government services, which were raised since 2015. Reverse increased land rents and drainage and irrigation charges. Reverse VAT on exports. Reverse VAT on building materials. Remove VAT on data and establish online training programs across the country. Promoting skills training by increasing technical and vocational training and apprenticeship schemes. Partner with private companies and institutions to provide skills training in key areas. Incentivize employers so as to promote youth employment. Establish a national job bank and labor exchange. Provide greater support to vulnerable groups, including the elderly and people living with disabilities. Simplify the tax system. Offer attractive tax incentives for business development and improve access to financing for investments. Now, this is the first section. This is an excerpt from the manifesto. Is much more comprehensive. So this is actually a condensed version, extracted from a more comprehensive document, which is about 90 pages. I believe it's about 90 pages. Now, let's just look at these measures that I just cited. These measures, you can go to, these were done, but don't just take my word. Let me point you in the direction where you can independently verify. You go on the Ministry of Finance website and look for Budget 2020, look for national budget speeches, and you download the budget speeches for 2020. You download all of them. And the very first budget speech, Budget 2020 speech, towards the end of the budget speech, you will see that all these measures on the fiscal measures and targets, all of these were done in the very first years. The very first year, a long list of targets were delivered in the first budget. With respect to job creation, the 50,000 target, I've done an assessment on that, and I I have demonstrated in a previous podcast, and I've written on this as well. I've demonstrated that they've easily exceeded the 50,000 target. Easily. Briefly, how did they exceed? How did they manage as a government through their stewardship of the economy and through their policies, economic policies? How did those collectively, altogether, result in the creation of 70,000 conservatively, exceeding the 50,000 target? Just look at one sector. In a single sector, the construction sector. The construction sector has several subsectors. You have housing, development, 50,000. That 50,000 house lots and turnkey homes, young professional homes and turnkey homes for low-income families. That alone enabled the creation of thousands of jobs in that sector alone, housing development alone, because they had to expand housing development, develop new housing areas. So you need skilled labor, unskilled labor. You need a large workforce, and construction is a very labor-intensive sector. There is private sector-driven construction as well. Private sector-driven construction as well. You have shore bases going up. You have hotels under construction. Almost every sector, tourism and hospitality, where you don't have who is not involved in getting into new construction, constructing new facilities. You have existing businesses, existing entities and individuals expanding. So there is expansion, there is growth of new opportunities in the construction sector alone, creating more than 10,000 jobs across the country. The oil and gas value chain, the oil and gas sector value chain, over 6,000 jobs. The service industry, which is a relatively large sector, accounting for about more than 15% of non-oil GDP. More than 15% of non-oil GDP. That sector would have expanded as well significantly. That enabled the creation of thousands of jobs. The transportation sector, I went through the number of hire car registration and minibuses and commercial vehicles. The transportation sector, the mining sectors. So all the sectors, what is happening in the construction sector alone? Easily more than 70,000 jobs, because part of that 70,000 as well was the restoration of jobs, job losses between the 2015-2020 period. So of that 70,000, you have about 20,000 jobs that were lost in the 2015-2020 period, and I've statistically demonstrated that in a report that I published. So the restoration of about 20,000 direct and indirect jobs. And the difference would have been new jobs created in the market. And I looked at it, the report that I published. I've pulled together statistics or indicators from different sources. I looked at the NIS registration of new employees. We looked at the labor force survey, and through extrapolation techniques with other existing data, that is how I determine that figure, which is a conservative number. Right? It's the report is out there. It's published on my social media pages and my LinkedIn profile, and some media outlets carried carried stories in it. So I will end here for today, and come next week we'll go through this manifesto. We'll take it one section at a time, perhaps, to examine those targets that were made, that were set in 2020, how the government performed in terms of meeting those targets, whether they met those targets, whether they over-deliver, whether they surpassed, or whether there was any shortfall in any areas. So thank you. Thank you once again. Thank you for tuning in as usual every week. I'll see you again next week, same time, same place. Catch you on the next episode. Thank you.